Everyone. Well, in light of the recent election results, I've seen a lot of liberal Catholics coming out of the woodwork, and really they've been doing this since the Dobbs decision, honestly, and for a long time before that, but it's really um, increased in frequency that them saying this. But a lot of liberal Catholics have been coming out of the woodwork trying to really gaslight us on how the church historically has approached the issue of abortion. There's this claim of discontinuity, actually. Now, I've done a couple streams on this in the past, but I wanted to just sit down and make a much shorter, perhaps a more focused video on the topic so that this, gaslighting can really be put to rest in a way that has a higher chance being received by more and more people since it's pretty easy to get lost in the weeds here. So, what I'll be doing in this video is I think about three things. First of all, I want to really articulate what the church's perennial teaching actually is on the issue of abortion. I mean, its condemnation goes all the way back to the Didache. Um, Secondly, I want to demonstrate that this teaching's continuity throughout the church's life throughout the ages has been constant even throughout developments in embryological thought. So I want to demonstrate that. And finally, there's a little message to the whole pro-life community that I want to get across in light of where the political winds have blown on the whole abortion issue since the Dobbs decision. Now, before we get into all of that, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It helps the algorithm. Share it, especially to those Catholics who might be confused, liberal Catholics, conservative Catholics, etc. And if you want to support my work, patreon.com/classicaltheist is a great way to do it. You get a whole lot of perks with that. Monthly article, monthly book recommendations, unlimited Q&A access through the messaging system, and also for the second tier, I'll do if you have a video topic that you want me to cover, I'll do that, or a streaming topic, you want me to react to content, I do that as well, and a couple other things sprinkled, throughout. Sometimes I'll just add some posts there that I don't necessarily add to Twitter or X, I guess. Um, and sometimes I and add in some other occasional like exclusive streams and things like that. So a great way to support my content. Um, okay, so that being out of the way, let's get into the video here. So what is the church's perennial teaching on abortion? Well, let's uh, let's just begin by saying that the church teaches definitively, so really at the infallible level of magisterial teaching, that direct abortion, that is, let's define it here, the deliberate and intentional termination of the life of an unborn human being, whether as an end or as a means, always constitutes a grave moral disorder. And why is that? Well, because it always and everywhere constitutes the deliberate ending or termination of an innocent life. And so, for that reason, it is murder in each and every case, right? The deliberate termination of an innocent life is murder, and it is always and everywhere wrong. It's intrinsically wrong. So, and that the church definitively teaches this is made clear from the following magisterial declaration. And we'll be getting into even more declarations than this, but this is, I think, the most recent, but also the highest level condemnation. And you find this in John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae. And so John Paul II says, quote, given such unanimity in the doctrinal and disciplinary tradition of the Church, Paul VI was able to declare that this tradition is unchanged and unchangeable. And we'll get to that document in a minute where he says that. Therefore, by the authority which Christ conferred upon Peter and his successors, so this is his preface to giving an infallible statement here. By the authority which Christ conferred upon Peter and his successors in communion with the bishops, who on various occasions have condemned abortion, and who in the aforementioned consultation, albeit dispersed throughout the world, have shown unanimous agreement concerning this doctrine, I declare that direct abortion, that is, abortion willed as a means or as an end, always constitutes a grave moral disorder since it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. This doctrine is based on the natural law and upon the written word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition, and taught by the universal and ordinary magisterium. No circumstance, no purpose, no law whatsoever can make licit an act which is intrinsically illicit, since it is contrary to the law of God, which is written in every human heart, knowable by reason itself, and proclaimed by the Church. And then I also want to quote what he says later, having to do with this really gets to the heart of the pro choice issue when it comes to legislating on the basis of that moral fact. So he goes on to say, quote, a particular problem of conscience can arise in cases where a legislative vote would be decisive for the passage of a more restrictive law aimed at limiting the number of authorized abortions in place of a more permissive law already passed or ready to be voted on. Such cases are not infrequent. It is a fact that while in some parts of the world there uh, continue to be campaigns to introduce laws favoring abortion, often supported by powerful international organizations and other nations, particularly those, rather in other nations, particularly those which have already experienced the bitter fruits of such permissive legislation, there are growing signs of rethinking in this matter. In a case like the one above mentioned, when it is not possible to overturn or completely abrogate a pro abortion law, an elected official whose absolute personal opposition to procured abortion was well known could licitly support proposals aimed at limiting the harm done by such a law and at lessening its negative effects at the level of general opinion and public morality. This does not in fact represent an illicit cooperation with an unjust law, but rather a legitimate and a proper attempt to limit its evil aspects. Unquote. But has this always been the teaching of the church? And that's the heart of this video. Many liberal Catholics argue that throughout the medieval period in particular, given the broad adherence to Aristotelian biology and embryology of the past, the church of the past was more lax on the issue than the church of the present. So that's the claim. They'll often cite two sources to back up this claim. One that's quasi-magisterial, I guess, and then the other, perhaps the most famous, would be from St. Thomas Aquinas, who is, of course, the common doctor. Now, their aim here is to show that, given the Church's purported inconsistency in determining when human life begins, there is, as a result of that, room for a Catholic to part ways with the Church's current stance on the issue and so support pro choice political campaigns. Now, this is really nonsense, and it's diabolical nonsense on many levels. But let's just begin with the first source that they like to jump to. And to do that, we got to go back to the 16th century under the reign of Pope Gregory XIV. Um, Now, since in those days the Pope had temporal sovereignty over the Papal States, this is just to give context, the papacy had a lot of direct input in how crimes would be dealt with by the secular power. And one of those crimes was, of course, abortion. Now, under his predecessor, Sixtus, there was this following penalty put in place. So I'm going to quote Sixtus V here. And Sixtus V said, therefore, we, after having represented the temerity of those who presume to violate the laws of matrimony by pretending to dissolve the indissoluble bond, and who with indecent incests are not ashamed to stain themselves, we are willing to exterminate our times also this evil as much as we can by the strength given to us by the Lord. All and whosoever men and women, of whatever state, degree, order, rank, and condition, even clerics, secular, or pertaining to whatsoever religious order, of whatever dignity, and ecclesiastic, or worldly illustrious preeminence, who by themselves or interposed third persons procure abortion of a fetus, so that it is expelled by means of blows, poisons, medicines, potions, weights, burdens, work, and labor imposed on pregnant women, um, and even by other unknown and extremely researched means, so that really abortion follows, or even the same pregnant woman who knowingly did the aforementioned did incur sanctions and punishments established by divine and human laws, and by canonic sanctions and apostolic constitutions. I know these popes are famous for run-on sentences, and which the civil and profane law inflicts upon true murderers and assassins who have actually and really committed murder. Here we accept the concepts and terms of all those laws and want them to be literally inserted in this document. And by this, our perpetually valid Constitution, we state in order that the same punishments and laws and constitutions are to be extended to the aforementioned case. So he's basically saying that abortion in at any stage, at any stage, is to be treated and is to be prosecuted as murder. Now, Pope Gregory, and then this is where there's this ambiguity introduced into this scenario, into this equation. Gregory took this and he did reform the penalty to now read that, quote, those who abort an inanimate or soulless fetus will not be guilty of true homicide because they have not killed a human being, a human person in actuality. Clerics involved in abortions will have committed a mortal sin, but they will not incur that same penalty, right? That same canonical irregularity. So what do we make of this? Well, first things first, let's be clear on what this decree is not saying. It is not saying that abortion of what was then referred to as a preeminent fetus would either be morally acceptable or even free from all civil penalties. This is very significant for two reasons. For one, while this decree does presuppose this Aristotelian medieval consensus with regard to a distinction made between a preanimate and an animate fetus, it merely lifts the penalty for murder. And so it does not in any way imply that such abortions would be free from the stain of grave moral guilt, and nor does it imply that such abortions would be legally protected in any way. This is simply not the pro-choice position. It does not at all suggest, even for a moment, that procuring an abortion of a preanimate fetus is a matter of personal choice or that it should be left to some kind of decision-making process between a woman and her physician. That is not given even a moment's worth of consideration. And we'll get into why this position would actually be repugnant to pro-choicers, but also a lot of pro-lifers who who would not believe in even the immorality of aborting a preanimate fetus if they conceded that as a category. But let's move on to St. Thomas Aquinas. I just wanted to clarify that one. Let's move on to St. Thomas Aquinas. He's the most famous example. It is claimed that because St. Thomas held that there was this 40-day period of delay in between conception and the ensoulment of a fetus, that if he were alive today, he would resonate with the more pro-choice position, at least prior to the 40th day of gestation. And while again it is true that he did hold to this erroneous Aristotelian consensus with regard to delayed ensoulment, it is again simply slanderous to claim that he would embrace a pro-choice political position. He would not. First and foremost, if he were alive today, he would happily leave behind that junk science of Aristotelian embryology on both scientific and theological grounds, and he would just assent without hesitancy the Holy See's current wisdom on the matter. That's what he would do as a loyal son of the Church. But more fundamentally, there's a deeper reason. Even if he continued to adhere to this Aristotelian biology, which to the surprise of a lot of Catholics has not actually been condemned by the Church, he would still believe that procured abortion of the preanimate fetus would be gravely sinful and subject to civil and canonical penalties. Now, while such penalties would be less severe than what would be incurred on someone who aborted an animate fetus, just logically, it would just fall short of the full penalty ascribed for someone who aborted an animate fetus. It would just fall short of the full penalty ascribed for murder. But it would remain quite serious and would absolutely be far beyond the pale for any pro-choice advocate. They would just not stand for it. In fact, the idea that the law would even frown upon abortion of a preanimate fetus, that is a fetus that's not considered a human person, that would be vehemently rejected by any pro-choice advocate as being part of some kind of, right-wing, extreme Christian nationalist agenda. And it would even be rejected, as I said, by a lot of pro-lifers. So far from St. Thomas's position being amicable to the pro-choice ideology, I think it's pretty clear that both St. Thomas and Pope Gregory When their positions are properly understood, they would be seen by pro-choice advocates as great villains of history against their conception of, women's rights or whatever. Um, Now, all of that being said, it should be clarified, very much so, that Pope Gregory's decree was reversed at the highest level of authority by both Pope Innocent the 11th, Pope Innocent the 9th, um, and it had to continue to be upheld to the present day. Innocent the 11th, for example, taught against the laxists of the time that procuring an abortion prior to animation would ever be licit. And Pius the 9th simply reverted back to Sixtus's omission of that distinction between the preanimate and the animate fetus when it comes to canonically prosecuting abortions. So, uh, and just to sum up this point, by the way, let me just quote a very landmark Vatican document which came out in 1974, basically reiterating everything I just said. So this is Paul VI did not write this, but it came under his Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So it says, quote, Innocent the Eleventh rejected the propositions of certain lax canonists who sought to excuse an abortion procured before the moment accepted by some as the moment of spiritual animation of a new being. In our days, the recent pontiffs have proclaimed the same doctrine with greatest clarity. Pius XI explicitly answered the most serious objections in Casti Connubii. Pius XII clearly excluded all direct abortion, that is, abortion either as an end or as a means. John the 23rd recalled the teaching of the Fathers on the sacred character of life, which from its beginning demands the action of God the Creator. Most recently, the Second Vatican Council, provided by Paul VI, has most severely condemned abortion, and I believe they're quoting Gaudium et Spes here. Life must be safeguarded with extreme care from conception. Abortion and infanticide are abominable crimes. The same Paul VI, speaking on the subject on many occasions, has not been afraid to declare that this teaching of the Church has not changed and remains unchangeable. So, despite the rather unimpressively sly attempts to subvert the continuity of the Church's teaching on this matter, the Church remains clear as ever. And even if, for example, that it could be demonstrated that human personhood did not begin rather until sometime after conception, like during gestation, the Church gives even further clarity about this hypothetical. In Donum Vitae, which I believe was under the CDF of Cardinal Ratzinger, in Donum Vitae, the Church teaches the following, quote, the congregation is aware of the current debates concerning the beginning of human life, concerning the individuality of the human being, and concerning the identity of the human person. The congregation recalls the teaching found in the Declaration on Procured Abortion, and subquote within this, from the time that the ovum is fertilized, new life has begun, which is neither that of the father nor that of the mother. It is rather the life of the new human being with its own growth. It would never be made human if it were not human already. To this perpetual evidence, modern genetic science brings valuable confirmation. It has been demonstrated that from the first instant the program is fixed as to what the living being will be. A man, this individual man, with characteristic aspects already well determined. Right from fertilization is begun the adventure of human life, and each of its great capacities requires time to find its place and to be in a position to act. Unquote the subquote, but continuing the document. This teaching remains valid and is further confirmed, if confirmation were needed, by the recent findings of human biological science, which recognizes that in the zygote resulting from fertilization, the biological identity of a new human individual is already constituted. Certainly, no experimental datum can in itself be sufficient to bring us to a recognition of a spiritual soul. Nevertheless, the conclusions of science regarding the human embryo provide a valuable indication for determining, or rather for discerning, by use of reason, a personal presence at the moment of this first appearance of human life. How could a human individual not be a human person? The magisterium has not expressly committed itself to an affirmation of a philosophical nature, but it constantly reaffirms the moral condemnation of any kind of procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Thus, the fruit of human generation, from the first moment of its existence, that is to say, from the moment the zygote has formed, demands an unconditional respect that is morally due to the human being in its bodily and spiritual totality. The human being is to be respected and treated as a person from the moment of conception, and therefore from the same time his rights as a person must be recognized, among which in the first place is the inviolable right of every innocent human being to life. This doctrinal reminder provides the fundamental criterion for the solution of the various problems posed by the development of the biomedical sciences in this field. Since the embryo must be treated as a person, it must also be defended in its integrity, tended and cared for to the extent possible in the same way as any other human being as far as medical assistance is concerned. So, unquote. And that's Donum Vitae. So at this point, I don't think there's any room left for doubt that the Catholic Church has always and throughout her entire lifespan here on earth condemned abortion and has always taught against its accessibility in public life. Even given that a distinction between a preanimate and an animate fetus, it makes no difference. It's always a human being, and even at the moment of conception, even if the spiritual soul is infused at some later date shortly after, even before that, it is an individual human body ready to receive the soul. And so the church teaches that even at that point, even given that hypothetical, even given that conditional, it would still require the fullness of the same rights that would be given to an ensouled human being. That's, again, on the presupposition that we accept this distinction. Um, okay, now before we close out this video, there is something I just wanted to say about the pro-life movement specifically. Um, Specifically what I see as like the primary failure of the pro-life movement. Now, first and foremost, let's just acknowledge the fact that there has been a massive failure. I mean, I obviously recognized, of course, the whole elephant in the room that Roe v. Wade was overturned. So, in one sense, how can it possibly uh, be alleged to have been a failure, right, in light of this monumental victory? Well, let's recall what's happened since the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision. Since the overturning of Roe, there has been, I don't think anyone can doubt this, a seismic, monumental leftward shift on the abortion issue. Not among politicians so much as among the people, the voters, which is why whenever the issue of abortion is put to a vote in a given state, in almost every case, the voters have opted for wider accessibility in the so called right to procure an abortion. Now, this is not me saying that it was a bad thing to overturn Roe. Of course not. But it is to say that this leftward shift in public opinion is proof that the pro life movement has failed to change hearts and minds in a way that would have primed the public to be more receptive to this top down political change. They simply weren't ready for that. Now, there are many reasons for this failure, but one such reason that I want to touch on, and I think is this reluctance on part of the pro life movement to situate the issue of abortion within a broader moral context in which it is truly found. Instead of making a moral concession after moral concession after moral concession, which it has been doing just to cater to certain sensibilities, um, and instead of keeping the issue as narrow in scope as possible, I think it's time that we be more bold in the strength of our convictions, not just about the fact that abortion is murder and wrong, but about why we think this and about where exactly the malice of abortion is to be rooted fundamentally in the moral order. That means we have to situate this issue of abortion within the um, broader context of the church's teaching on marriage and the family, on sexuality itself. We have to speak boldly about what the church teaches about masculine and feminine roles in marriage, society, and the cosmos, according to the traditional teaching of the church and the traditional wisdom of the church, the teaching of St. Paul, the teaching of the Fathers, the teaching of St. Thomas, Pius the Ninth, Leo the 13th, Pius the 11th, Pius the 12th, and we have to interpret the teachings of John Paul II through the prism of these prior papal admonitions. And only when we do this can the church's opposition to abortion, at the very least, it can be understood as part of this broader, coherent framework. And when hearts and minds are won on these terms, they will be won, I think, in a way that's more resolute and unshakable. It'll take time, but I think the fight is worth it to lead to that end. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope it helped dispel those myths. I hope that you're a little bit more certain and sure of the continuity of the church's teaching on this issue. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, let me know what you think. That's really helpful for me, but I also obviously enjoy hearing what you think. If you want to support my work, again, patreon.com/classicaltheist. It really helps me continue to do what I'm doing and try to put out more and more content this month and next month and going forward. And God bless you, and I'll see you in the next one.